Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 43, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Jeffrey Kessler of Virginia to be Under Secretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Jeffrey Kessler of Virginia to be Under Secretary of Commerce for Industry and Security shall be brought to a close? The ayes and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blackburn, Capito, Graham, Haggerty, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Marshall, Moran, Moreno, Murkowski, Ricketts, Sullivan, Tillis, Young. Mr. Crapo, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Gallego, Sanders.
Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt. Aye. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mrs. Britt. Mrs. Britt. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Justice. Mr. Justice. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis. Aye.
Sir Curtis, are you on this for
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. No. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Markey, Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Baldwin, Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Lummis, Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Kim, no. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Welch, no. All right. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Kay, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Warnock? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Ms. Alsobrooks? No. Mr. Van Hollen? No. Mrs. Murray? No. Mr. Schiff? No. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Lujan, no.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 54, the nays are 45, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Jeffrey Kessler, Virginia, to be Undersecretary for Industry and Security.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise to discuss the House continuing resolution that will be before this body over the next couple of days. And I want to begin by talking about a Senate Armed Services Committee meeting that we had yesterday morning at 9:30 a.m. So for all paying attention, the House acted on a continuing resolution on Tuesday night. The budget deadline is at the end of the day Friday, and it takes two houses to do a budget. But what happened is when the House acted on their portion of it, they decided to leave town. They thought it would just be great if they just left town before the budget was even done. And they sent us a, quote, continuing resolution that would be unprecedented because it would mean that the government of the United States would have operated not under a traditional appropriations bill, but instead under a CR for the entire year. To those who don't do the Washington speak, what's the difference between a CR and a real appropriations budget? The way I describe it is this. If you're driving a vehicle, you want to drive by looking through the windshield. Where you are going, that's what the budget does. You budget for the year ahead of you based upon the facts on the ground, the realities in the world, the priorities that you've embraced, the challenges that you'll face. That's what a budget is supposed to do. When you operate under a continuing resolution, you're driving by looking in the rearview mirror. You're instead embracing decisions that were made a while ago and just saying, well, we can't even reach an accord about going forward, so let's instead let's do what we did last month, let's do what we did last year, because we are unable to reach an agreement. A continuing resolution has been somewhat normal for a couple of months. If we don't reach a budget deal by September 30, it's pretty normal that we do a CR through the end of the calendar year. But in every year that I've been here, Congress has been able to, at some point, find not the backward-looking CR, but the forward-looking appropriations bill, put it in place so that we are spending money based on the priorities that are important right now. What's pending before the Senate now is not that forward-looking budget. Instead, it's this vehicle that has come over from the House that would, for the first time, have us not budgeting based on the windshield, but instead driving by what's in the rearview mirror. We had a Armed Services Committee hearing yesterday. It looks at this very important metric. How ready are the different branches of the American military to fight tomorrow if we need to? And we have this hearing every year, and we usually invite to the hearing the vice service chiefs of each of the service branches. So instead of the service chief of the Navy, the deputy, Vice Admiral Kilby, we'll invite the deputy of all the branches, and they come and they talk to us about how they measure readiness and where we stand. And they were all before us yesterday in a hearing that was chaired by Alaska Senator Sullivan, with the ranking member, Hawaii Senator Hirono, and a number of others there at the hearing. Now remember, it had just been 12 hours before that the House had passed the continuing resolution. And so folks were aware of what was on the table in this hearing yesterday morning. And what did our military leadership say to us about the continuing resolution that we are going to be asked to vote on in the next day or so? Well, let me just read a couple of quotes from the military leaders. Admiral Kilby: consistent and predictable funding is foundational to our improvement efforts. The Navy will need to make hard choices this year if we are operating under a full-year continuing resolution. And so I asked him this question. I'm just going to read the exchange that I had to him. Admiral Kilby, I think you testified in your open testimony that under a CR, 1/5 of our ships will miss their maintenance schedule. Did I hear that right? Admiral Kilby said, specifically 11 ships, those maintenance availabilities are at risk. I followed up. Okay, so we want to get to 80% ready on ships and subs. Where are we now? Admiral Kilby said, depending on the day, around 67%. I then said, what will 1/5 of ships missing their maintenance schedule under the CR, what will that do to our quest to get to 80% readiness for ships and subs? Admiral Kilby, it'll certainly be a setback. We'll take a penalty there. And all of the other vice service chiefs said the same thing on behalf of the Marines and the Air Force and the Space Force and the Army. Operating under a full year CR will hurt readiness, will hurt our national security. This is what the Pentagon is telling us about the bill we're going to be voting on in the next day or so. But it wasn't just the military leaders who said that. The chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee, Senator Sullivan, the CR from a readiness standpoint, I think that none of this is helpful. He described the frequent use of CRs as, quote, a failure on the part of Congress. And then my friend and colleague, who was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Wicker, here is what he said about the bill that we're going to vote on in the next couple of days. I will say this about the fact that this is the first year-long CR for the Department of Defense. This is a shame on our process, and it is not in keeping with what the founders intended. This is the chairman, the Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Service Committee's opinion about what a year-long CR will do to our national security. So why are we going to vote for it? Why are we taking it up and rushing to pass it? When our military leadership says it's a bad idea, and when the chairman of the Armed Services Committee says it's a bad idea, why would we contemplate it? Well, Senator Sullivan sort of hinted at it when he said it's better than a shutdown, but those are not the options. This was a hearing Wednesday morning at 9:30 in the morning. The budget deadline is not till the end of the day Friday. We don't have to accept that it's either a security damaging continuing resolution or a shutdown, because we're the Senate of the United States. There is an attitude among senators here that because the House came up with a partisan bill and sent it to us and then decided to skip town Tuesday night, that we just have to go along. I thought the Senate was an independent branch of Congress. I thought the Senate was the greatest deliberative body in the world. I don't think the Speaker of the House is the czar of the Senate. And when he sends us a continuing resolution 3 days before a budget deadline and then leaves town, I don't think the Senate of the United States is bound to follow his wishes. Instead, we should do our own jobs and do the right thing for the country. If the Armed Services Chair says this hurts defense, then let's get it right. If the chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee says the CR hurts defense, then let's get it right. And the good news, Mr. President, is we have an opportunity to get it right. It is not completely clear as I stand on the floor, but it looks likely that there could be a vote today or tomorrow on an alternative that I'll call the getting it right alternative. What is the getting it right alternative? We would extend the current spending level for 30 days and then finish the budget. We would decide we don't want to drive looking in the rearview mirror. We want to drive looking in the windshield. And we would get an appropriations deal that wouldn't hurt our readiness. And I'm just talking about one priority. I could have other colleagues stand here and talk about how this CR hurts education priorities, health priorities, mental health priorities, transportation priorities, emergency response. We don't have to accept that. And frankly, to earn the label U.S. Senator, we shouldn't accept it. We should do the get it right alternative. And the get it right alternative, which has been proposed by Senator Murray and others, is to do a simple 30-day extension of existing spending, no amendments, no adjustments, no anomalies, no quirks for 30 days, and then get an appropriations deal done that can pass this body and pass the House, and we can do it. We're very, very close. I'm not in the Appropriations Committee, but in my discussions with appropriators, they say we're extremely close, we can do this, and we should. And so, Mr. President, I'll just urge my colleagues, as you contemplate a vote on this House CR that, in my view, does great damage to many priorities, you don't just have to go along with the House work product, especially when they show disrespect to the Senate by skipping town Tuesday night, thinking that they could jam us by doing so. You don't have to go along with a work product that even the chairman of the Armed Services Committee says hurts our national readiness. You don't have to go along with a work product when Pentagon officials who have made this their lives look at us and tell us this will hurt national security. There's a better strategy, and we should embrace it. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, over the past 2 months, we have seen...
Senate is in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, over the past 2 months, we have seen chaos unleashed across our country as Donald Trump and Elon Musk take a chainsaw to our federal government, firing thousands of federal workers en masse with no explanation. More firings to come. I suspect by the time they're through, if they are ever through, hundreds of thousands of federal employees will be fired. Rather than making government more efficient, these indiscriminate cuts are gutting our government from the inside out, effectively eliminating crucial programs and offices. And while Republicans shamefully paint hardworking federal workers as faceless bureaucrats, we know that our federal workers do important work. From ensuring Social Security checks go out to providing care for veterans and so much more. And ever since, and every state has individual federal employees doing critical work, often work that goes unseen. In Hawaii, for example, Fish and Wildlife Service employees are responsible for keeping invasive species out of our state. Once invasive species arrive in our islands, it is often impossible to eradicate them. That is why the work of these employees are so important. Last month, the Trump administration fired a Fish and Wildlife Service employee whose job was to keep one particular invasive species, the brown tree snake, out of our state. You can see, Mr. President, it is pretty ferocious. This picture depicts a brown tree snake eating a bird whole. Native to Australia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, the brown tree snake was accidentally introduced to Guam during World War II and has been wreaking havoc on that island ever since. One of the most destructive invasive species in the world, the brown tree snake is responsible for the extinction of at least a dozen animal species in Guam, including many of the island's forest-dwelling birds and birds and lizards. It also went after Guam's native bats, domestic poultry, even pets. As its population grew, the brown tree snake began invading power facilities, causing short circuits and frequent power outages. To this day, brown tree snakes cause nearly 200 outages a year in Guam, costing $4.5 million each year in what they're doing in repairs. I mean, you can imagine what kind of havoc, lost productivity by the millions. And despite years of various attempts to control the brown tree snake, as of 2024, Guam's population of brown tree snakes is estimated to be in the millions. Sadly, it is highly unlikely that this invasive and destructive species will ever be fully eliminated from Guam. Thankfully, the snake does not yet exist in Hawaii or anywhere in the continental U.S., but that is not by accident or chance. It is because of the tireless work of federal employees from several agencies that has kept this snake out of Hawaii. Since the creation of the brown tree snake program nearly 20 years ago, Not a single brown tree snake has been found in Hawaii because the program works. The federal investment in equipment, training, and hiring personnel works. Several agencies, including the Department of the Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Defense, work together on the research, interdiction, and management of the brown tree snake. But the firing of just one individual who served as the brown tree snake program coordinator in Hawaii threatens to nullify all of that successful work. This individual was responsible for ensuring that biosecurity protocols were being followed and coordinating amongst the different agencies involved in the program. And he has been doing this for a number of years. He has the expertise to do this well, to keep this snake out of Hawaii. He oversaw the implementation of the brown tree snake program for the entire Pacific region. And as I give this speech today, his position, eliminated for no good reason by Musk and Trump, his position to this day remains vacant. And as we know, there is a hiring freeze imposed by the president also. So if he is not reinstated, the likely scenario will be that it will not be a matter of if brown tree snakes are introduced to Hawaii, but when. And let's be clear, if this snake makes it to Hawaii, I fear it is only a matter of time before it reaches the rest of our country. Trump and Elon Musk think they can just take a chainsaw to our federal workforce and budget, hacking away with no consequences. But in 10 years, when brown tree snakes have decimated Hawaii's ecosystem and wreaked havoc in other states across our country, it will obviously be too late. Mr. President, the brown tree snake is a real threat that Hawaii takes seriously. And in every state across our country, red and blue alike, there are federal workers doing critical, often unseen work to protect the health, safety, and well-being of our communities. Critical federal employees. Firing these employees will inevitably make our country and our communities less safe, less prosperous, and more vulnerable to outside threats, from foreign governments to invasive species and everything in between. I stand ready to work with anyone serious about making our government more efficient, but these cuts are having the opposite effect. I urge my Republican colleagues to join me in standing up for the critical federal programs in these states, in our states, and to the well-being of the American people. By rejecting this administration's attacks on our government and the people who keep it working and who protect our communities. Mr. President, I yield back. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arkansas.
I ask consent to end the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. Yes. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arkansas.
Here we go again. In just a little over 24 hours, federal funding will run out and the government will shut down. Let me state for the record that my Republican colleagues and I are ready to get on with matters and ready to fund the government for the rest of this year. And we all know that the faster we move it over the finish line, the faster our federal government can get to work on behalf of the American people and implement the agenda that the American people elected us to get done. But after our Democratic friends had a nice long lunch on Capitol Hill yesterday, Senator Schumer took to the floor to announce that their caucus will not support funding the government because, as he put it, Republicans chose a partisan path. But here's what Senator Schumer is really saying. Democrats would rather shut down the government than pass the funding bill just to shift blame to Republicans for our current funding predicament. Democrats are going to shut down the government to protect the government. In the next 24 hours even, Democrats are planning to use the very same filibuster that they have opposed and tried to abolish to shut down the government. In the last administration, former Vice President Kamala Harris said that Joe Biden and the Democrats are, quote, kind of done with those archaic Senate rules, end quote. But here they are using those archaic Senate rules to shut down the government. There's nothing that could explain such a drastic change of heart, colleagues, other than rank hypocrisy. Democrats are quick to criticize Republican efforts to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in our bureaucracies on behalf of hardworking American taxpayers. Yet in the same breath, Democrats are fighting to withhold the paychecks of air traffic controllers, our troops, federal custodial staff. They can't be serious. The level of hypocrisy displayed by the minority leader and my Democratic colleagues is appalling to the office they hold and the constituents they serve. A government shutdown, of course, doesn't just affect the federal workforce. For instance, food inspectors would be forced to stop their work, interrupting our food supply chains. It's as if the Democrats are trying to finish Joe Biden's job of driving up prices at the grocery store. So let me remind everyone of why we are on the verge of a government shutdown. Just a few months ago, Senator Schumer and my Democratic colleagues held the majority here. During that time, Republicans joined with Democrats to vote 11 out of 12 government funding bills from committee. 11 out of 12. 6 of them were unanimous. The other 5 passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. That would seem to be a great accomplishment in a too often divided Washington. 11 out of 12 bills, 6 unanimous, 5 with overwhelming bipartisan support. But even though we had all those spending bills ready to go last summer on a bipartisan basis, then Majority Leader Schumer failed to bring a single bill to the floor from August through the end of last year. Not a single bill. Even though, yet let me say it again, 11 out of 12 passed out of committee, 6 were unanimous, and the other 5 were overwhelmingly bipartisan. Not a single one. Senator Schumer had 224 days to bring those bills to the floor for a vote. 224 days. What did we do instead? He chose to prioritize election year stunts, trying to distract voters from Joe Biden's disastrous border crisis. He had a vote on mandating government-funded fertility treatments for biological men, more important than funding the government. We also confirmed a whole host of unqualified Biden nominees you've never heard of for jobs you didn't know existed, not to mention a whole host of unqualified judges in states with 2 Democratic senators who couldn't have gotten confirmed for the first 4 years and were only jammed through in a lame duck session, when we also could have been passing those spending bills to fund the government so we wouldn't be in this position. Senator Schumer claims to care about the livelihoods of federal workers, but as leader, he seemed more preoccupied. Partisanship is the reason for shutting down the government. Spare me. It continued this year. Since Republicans took over, he blocked negotiations that would have made this funding bill a bipartisan effort from the start. Senator Collins, the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and Congressman Cole, the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, made multiple offers to their Democratic counterparts to negotiate on a bipartisan basis government funding bills just like we did last summer. But no, Senator Schumer blocked it time and time again until just a few days ago. Yet now, supposedly, the clock has run out. And he wants another 30 days. Another 30 days when he had 224 days last year to do this. When we've had over 60 days this year to negotiate on a bipartisan basis. No, the time for those negotiations has regrettably passed. It's time to finish last year's business and move on to this year's business. And Democrats have one last chance to join Republicans and support a simple year-long funding bill. Republicans invite and encourage our Democratic colleagues to join us in this effort to keep the government funded for the American people we all serve. Shutting our government down, as many of my Democratic colleagues are apparently considering, is not just some political stunt. There are real and consequential national security risks if they choose to go through with this reckless scheme. A government shutdown will disrupt military training and could force us to cancel planned exercises with our allies and partners. These are the very same alliances that Democrats claim to care so much about supporting and preserving. Furthermore, a shutdown will disrupt ongoing work to modernize our nuclear forces, which is already behind schedule. Any further delay could make this bad situation even worse. And the potential Schumer shutdown will hurt military preparedness by slowing recruiting, creating uncertainty in our defense supply chains, and impacting our ability to produce badly needed munitions. This is not the message of strength that we want to send to the allies we stand beside and the enemies we stand against. To my Democratic colleagues who still believe that shutting down the government is the principal choice, that you need to, again, it's hard for me to explain their position, shut down the government to protect the government. Let me ask you simply. 6 months ago, Senator Schumer said, quote, "If the government shuts down, it will be average Americans who suffer most," end quote. That was Senator Schumer. What's happened in the last 6 months? Nothing, as far as I can tell, except who the American people elected to lead the government. So if the Schumer shutdown stunt is just a threat to get Republicans to agree to a fake short-term extension, that brings us right back to where we are now. Again, what's the point? The Democrats' hypocritical arguments reveal, once again, they're not serious about putting their duty to the American people above partisanship, pettiness, and pride. I invite them all to justify the Schumer shutdown to the parents who must postpone a trip to a national park with their children after months of saving and planning. Or explain your reasoning for the Schumer shutdown to the veteran who has already taken a day off work to sign up for health care at his regional benefits office, only to find it closed. Or defend the Schumer shutdown to the federal employee who puts all of her groceries on a credit card to make sure there's enough money left at the end of the month to cover her rent. My friends, we have two choices before us, and they're quite simple. Either keep the government open and working for the people, or shut it down to do what exactly, I don't know. I think we can all agree that the American people deserve better than a government that is a day late and a couple $2 billion short. So I encourage my Democratic colleagues, vote with us to simply fund the government. Let's not have a Schumer shutdown. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, as people all over this country understand, we are a nation today that faces enormous crises. Sadly, the continuing resolution passed Tuesday in the U.S. House and which will come to this body very shortly, not only does nothing to address these crises, but in fact, it makes a bad situation much worse. Today, at a time when we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had in the history of this country, 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. And what that means, Mr. President, I grew up in a family living paycheck to paycheck. It means that people are worried about how they're going to afford housing. What happens if their landlord raises the rent? People go to the grocery store and they see the high price of food and wonder how they're going to feed their kids. People are looking at the outrageous cost of child care, but you need child care if you're going to go to work. How can you afford child care? Our health care system is dysfunctional. People worry about how they can afford health care if they are lucky enough to be able to find a doctor. That is the reality of what's going on in our country today. Rich are getting richer. Working people are struggling, and 800,000 Americans are sleeping out in the streets. So given that reality, what does this bill do? The bill written by the right-wing extremists in the House of Representatives without any bipartisan discussion at all. What does this bill do? Well, let me count the ways that it makes the financial struggles of working people even more difficult than they are today. And it does all of that, Mr. President, to lay the groundwork for a start. Some 22% of our seniors in this country are trying to survive on $15,000 a year or less, which to me is really quite incredible. I don't know how anybody, let alone a senior, survives on $15,000 a year or less. Half of our seniors are trying to survive on $30,000 a year or less. So what does the Trump-Musk administration do to address the terrible economic pressures on seniors all over America? Well, they got a brilliant idea. They illegally fire thousands of workers at the Social Security Administration with plans to cut that staff in half. Mr. President, in America today, 30,000 people die each year waiting to receive their Social Security disability benefits because of a grossly understaffed and under-resourced Social Security Administration. My office, and I expect your office, and I expect every other office, gets calls every day from seniors saying, I'm having a problem with Social Security. I can't make contact with the Social Security people. They're not getting back to me. And that is because today they are understaffed. If Musk and Trump get their way and the Social Security Administration staff is cut in half, nobody can deny that that is a death sentence for many thousands of seniors who desperately need their benefits. Now, Mr. Musk, who's worth a few $100 billion, may not understand that there are millions of seniors in this country who have nothing in the bank, worry every day how they're going to heat their homes or buy the food that they need. And if they can't get the benefits that they need, some of them will in fact die. And let me be clear, when you have Mr. Congress and lying, outrageously lying, about millions of people who are 150 or 200 years of age receiving Social Security benefits, a total lie. Everybody should understand what's going on. Trump and Musk are laying the groundwork for dismantling the most successful federal program in history, Social Security, a program that keeps over 27 million Americans out of poverty. And by the way, just to set the record straight, over 99% of the more than 70 million Social Security checks that go out each month are going to people who earned those benefits. Over 99%. People 150 or 500 years of age are not getting Social Security checks. But this continuing resolution passed in the House is not just a vicious attack on Social Security. It is an attack on the veterans of our nation, the men and women who put their lives on the line to defend our country. While we made some progress under the Biden administration in improving veterans' health care, the truth is that the VA has remained significantly understaffed. In the fourth quarter of 2024, there were 36,000 vacancies at the VA. We needed 2,400 more doctors, 6,300 more registered nurses, 3,400 more schedulers, 1,800 more social workers, and 1,200 more custodians. So what does the Trump administration and Mr. Musk do to address this very serious workforce shortage? Their answer is that they are threatening to dismantle the VA by firing 83,000 employees. In other words, you got a shortage today, and their solution to the shortage is to fire 83,000 workers. Not only does this CR do nothing to stop that, but it cuts more than $20 billion in funding needed to provide care for veterans exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic substances next year. Mr. President, pathetically, our nation, the richest country on the planet, and that is often reflected in the crises facing many public schools today. Throughout America, children are coming into school hungry. Kids are coming into school with serious mental issues. Kids are coming into school from dysfunctional families often dealing with drug abuse. And what is the Trump-Musk administration doing about that crisis? Well, their response was interesting. Just the other day, they fired half of the staff at the Department of Education. That means that it will be far harder to administer the Title I program that helps 26 million low-income kids get the education they need and pays the salaries of some 180,000 public school teachers throughout the country. So how does a school in a working-class community survive if you don't get the funds to pay the teachers? Further, it means that it will be far harder to administer the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, that provides vital resources for 7.5 million kids with disabilities. We have made progress in a bipartisan way over the last number of years to say to families that if your kid has a disability, that kid can still go to a public school. There will be services available for that kid. But when you cut the Department of Education staff here in Washington in half, that is going to be extremely difficult to do. And it